All right, welcome everybody. This is week 2 of FDLS130. Once again, my name is Jared Champion, Dr. Jared Champion, and I am your instructor, as you all have probably seen already. Hopefully this is not a surprise to you, because if it's a surprise to you in week 2, we've got a lot of bigger issues sort of to deal with. So I'm grateful for the folks who were able to make it here today. We're really excited to be here talking about all of these different materials and different pieces of work that we have to do today. Let's talk here first. I'm going to share my screen and we are going to go over today's agenda. And so this is just for everybody's understanding of where we're going in the next hour, what we're going to cover. Our hope is to be finished within an hour. We're going to start here first with housekeeping, which we'll talk a little bit about books. I know there have been a lot of concerns about books. We're going to talk a little bit about deadlines, make sure everybody's okay on that, and then the assignments as well. That's where we're going to start today. We're going to talk then about improving paragraphs, and we're going to talk specifically on the topics of editing versus revising. And so when I say revise a paper, I want you to have a better understanding of what that means than just cleaning up comma errors and misspellings. I want you to understand why revision is necessary, but also I want you to have a solid understanding of what that means, so you don't just sit down frustrated and feeling like you're willing to put in the work but not sure what it looks like. That's really a sort of a recurring theme in my classes, so be aware of that. We're going to talk a lot about the idea of adding quality to your papers and specificity while removing fluff and generalities. And fluff, of course, is what we're probably all a little bit familiar with, especially if you've ever dealt with any writing anxiety where you're not sure how you're going to reach page length. So sometimes you'll do your very best to put everything you can down on paper. And then from there, if it's too short, then you go through and you add fluff, which nobody thinks that's good writing, but everybody thinks that everybody knows that it will fill that need of reaching page length. So it's a really important skill that we're going to learn today, or we're going to keep learning or begin learning so we can keep learning throughout the next 8 weeks. Then we're going to talk about commas, and we're going to talk about commas at introductions, independent and dependent clauses, and then we're going to talk about fanboys. Does anybody know what fanboys refers to already? Do we have any conjunction junction Schoolhouse Rock people in the house? Any fanboys? Nope. It's totally fine if you don't know what it means. We'll get to it and you'll understand it. And then, of course, we talked about this a little before we started the recording. There's going to be a space here for we questions. So even if you're joining us where you're not watching along with us right now, if you're not in the Zoom room with us, these are questions that your representatives for the day here, Jessica, Kaya, and Ariana, are going to be able to ask on your behalf. So if they have a question, they're going to ask it. And these will be questions that ideally will apply to everybody. And then once we stop the recording, there'll be a separate time for everybody to ask me questions, those questions that are applicable just to specific individual specific situations. Any questions for the good of the order from the crew here today before we get started? All right, great. So let's talk a little bit about the books. Books have been a little bit of a struggle. So a couple of things that sort of happened just to kind of give you the timeline of it. The book order was put in, but the bookstore has a little bit of a wonky system. So the book order went in, we got a confirmation that it went in. That was early October, or mid-October rather. And then the books didn't show up for whatever reason. I'm not sure if it was a computer glitch. I think that's probably the case. But then we started the class, and so things kind of got a little sideways for people. So what we did is we had the announcement posted to Canvas that said, here's the link to a Google version of the book so people can make their way through. I believe it was a different edition, but it would suffice for the time being. What you should know now is if you don't have the books in hand, hopefully you've got them on order, and the link should work for the next 2 weeks so that you're able to still make steady progress. But you'll want to make sure you have the book so that if that link quits working, or if it disappears for whatever reason, you want to make sure that you have that book in hand. What's also really important about this part of the process is knowing that you should still be making steady progress on that work, but know that there are some hitches there. Just sort of off topic a little bit, but related, Mercer employs a system called the opt-out system, which is for the Bear Bundle. So the Bear Bundle is where when you sign up for a class, the bookstore automatically purchases those books for you unless you decide to opt out of the Bear Bundle. You can do this on the Mercer Bookstore website. And typically speaking, The bare bundle is a good deal for people if you are taking a class in, say, the sciences where books are very expensive, because it typically will be a little less. What you should know as well is that when you start any new class, the book orders are due to the bookstore very early. So for example, by the end of November, I'll need to have my book orders in for spring. This is part of a law that was put in place by President Obama years and years ago. And it was specifically put in place so that you all can start bargain shopping for books and make full use of the range of online resources that are available. So start checking the bookstore. So don't wait for Canvas, because Canvas, if that opens the day the class starts, you're already sort of behind. But the bookstore will know what books you're going to need well before Canvas is posted, because we as faculty might not open Canvas until the morning classes start. So start looking ahead, and then you can kind of bargain shop. My personal recommendation off record is, typically speaking, especially in COPA, you're probably better off opting out of the bare bundle. And it's partially because of what we're running into right here, that you can go to the bookstore, find the books you need, and order them less expensively online, but you have to be looking ahead to kind of get that advantage. But it'll really help, especially because we do these 8-week sessions. So if it takes you 2 or 3 weeks to get the book, you might even be close to halfway through the course. And that's a really tough one to kind of navigate from there. It's also important here that just as a gentle reminder, that for doing the classwork itself, so writing the journals or writing the reflections or the post, you a phone and a tablet will not suffice for a million different reasons. But part of the reason is what we're seeing with the books. So a number of people have reached out to me and said, I don't have the books, I haven't been able to start, but we posted the announcement with the link for the book. So the reason that I bring that up is, typically speaking, on the tablet apps or the phone apps, they won't show a couple of key features. One of them being the announcements don't show up very smoothly, and then feedback doesn't show up at all. So if you have a phone or a tablet, you won't be able to see when I'm giving you feedback to make your papers better. It won't actually show that. It'll just show your final grade, which isn't very useful for making you better. It's only useful for showing you how you did in the past. And so make sure that you're using a computer. If you don't have a computer and you're sort of worried about when I'm saying that, so a couple of things you can do. Number one is every Mercer library, including the centers at Douglas and the center in Henry, have laptops you can check out for 3 days at a time. And there's not a huge demand on them right now. So you could check them out, and after 3 days, you could go recheck them out. So it's a little bit of a headache because you have to kind of go check it out. But ultimately, it's a lot less headache than retaking a course because you didn't have the technology necessary to make it through. The other thing is, if you live too far away from Mercer, go visit your local public library, which is probably really well equipped. I worked before coming to Mercer as the board of directors director for the libraries up in North Georgia, and they had great resources available for people to go sit down and do work in a library. It's often very quiet, and if you have little ones, it's even better because they'll have children's books, and often you can even check out things like puzzles. And there's some really great resources where the library I worked at, if you have little ones, that's often a concern. So apologies if it's not a concern for you all, but I know a couple of people have little ones kind of bouncing about. They had passes you could check out for free to go to the aquariums, to go to the zoos. You could do that as well. So it's a good way to kind of balance that, where you say, listen, we're going to go to the library. I want you to read a book for a little while, then we'll check out a pass and we'll go to the zoo, or we'll do that on the weekend or something of the sort. So don't be discouraged if you don't have a computer right now, but certainly it's right now is the time to make a plan to make sure you have access to that, because it's a lot more difficult to retake the class. And that's typically what ends up happening. Not trying to sound negative, but I've seen quite a few students. I've almost never seen a student make it through if they're not working on a laptop specifically or a computer for the paper assignments. It's too, if not impossible, it's pretty darn close. So we don't want that to happen. Last thing that I'll say on this, and I know I sound like the cranky old man on a porch, so forgive me for that. Last thing that I'll say is that we made a pretty big push in COPA to make sure that a Chromebook would work for you. So if you can't afford a laptop, a Chromebook, typically you can buy those for about $150, and those will serve you very well for what we're doing here at COPA and for the years to come. So they're really easy to use. They're generally pretty inexpensive. You can get some used ones. I've seen them as low as $100. But they typically about 150 will get you a really functional one that will do everything you need to make sure you're really successful here at COPA. Let's talk here about deadlines and assignments. So these are sort of part and parcel of each other. They're very similarly related. So here on the agenda, we're just making our way through. As you recall, so with the arrival of little dude here, we took the first week's assignments and those deadlines were extended to today. So if you were working on week 1, today is the day when all of the different assignments will be due, but it's also the day that the first set of assignments are due for week 2. Week 2 involves 3 different ed puzzles, so they're all pretty accessible. I believe the longest of them might be 9 minutes, so they're very doable, I think, to get those 3 finished. And then also the initial discussion post and the quiz will be due today. So have those on your radar. There might be another assignment kind of tucked away in there, but work your way through the module and make sure you're turning in that work on time, because let's talk about this piece with the deadlines, a couple of different things. Working through, the first thing is, if we're thinking about success, the number one indicator of potential success in college, full stop, is not intelligence. It's actually punctuality and turning in that work on time. So if you turn in all of your work on time, you're going to be fine. This is kind of the opposite of the computer thing, right? That I've only seen successful students when turning in work on time. That's always the case. It's the weirdest thing. I don't know what it is. It doesn't, I like to think of myself as a pretty bright dude, but the people who always made better grades than me were the people who were turning in their work on time, even if they might have struggled with some of the sort of the harder thinking that I felt like I was capable of doing. That's a weird humble brag, I guess, but roll with me anyway, right? The next thing about these deadlines is it's also important at this point to be thinking of the late policy work so that you don't get too discouraged. So say for instance, you're not feeling great today, and it's really important for you to get better because maybe you have some little ones you have to take care of and you've got work, and if you don't get better or you don't get good rest today, then it could spiral and things could get really tough. I'm super empathetic to that. And that's why that late policy is pretty small, right? So if you turn in work a little bit late, a day late, it's a very small deduction to your work. The rub is, of course, that policy has to apply to everyone, because I'm a doctor, but I'm not that kind of doctor. So I can't make those kind of determinations about who's too sick for these. So when we're thinking about that, first thing is, if you're not feeling well, you can certainly let me know, and I'm happy to be empathetic, and I'm going to do my best to be supportive, and I can find ways to help you be successful and to be efficient in your work. So I can help you. For example, if you reach out to me today and said, I'm not feeling great, how do I make sure that I do as much as possible, but I still get some rest? Then I might say, my recommendation is to do the ed puzzles, because those are something you can do and have out of the way, earn full credit for them. But maybe I would take a late deduction on the discussion board, because those are going to require more thought and more time, but it's the same number of points for the initial discussion post as the first 3 ed puzzles. So go do the ed puzzles, right? Those are the types of things that I can offer. So I want to make sure that you feel supported, but also that everything is consistent for everybody as well. I know that's I sound like a cranky old man today, so I'm really sorry. I promise I'm not cranky. I'm feeling great today. All right, let's go back here and let's talk a little bit about these paragraphs. So we've been working on a description paper, and some people have actually gone so far as to turn in their description paper already. Totally golden on that. I'm happy you're turning in your work. Turning in your work now and turning it in on time. I'm grateful for that. Now, if you decide you want to take a couple extra days to turn this in, then that's fine as well, because I don't think it's due until Monday. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of editing versus revision. So when I say editing versus revision, does anyone have a guess or some idea of what it might mean to edit something versus to revise it? This is sort of a question for everybody here. Ariana, go for it. You don't have to raise your hand for this. You can just call it right out. Thank you for that, though.
Oh, I would say that when you edit something, you're more of taking big chunks out of your writing, while revising is maybe adding a comma there, making sure your structure, you already have your structure when you're revising. While editing, you can take bigger chunks of information out
Oh, yeah. I see what you're saying. I think your definitions are great. I think if we just switch them, then it's perfect. It's
Oh,
spot on there. Yeah, it's perfect though, because editing is the idea. Typically, it's what refers to exactly what you described, where you're cleaning up commas, maybe you're taking some things out, you're sort of tweaking it on the sentence level. So the material or the content's not going to change with editing. Editing is more about the mechanics. Revising is about the presentation or the content itself. So presentation means what you're actually, how you're saying things, and then the content is what you're actually saying. So I like that idea as well that you brought up, Ariana, because the idea of taking stuff out is something that is really important, that willingness to take things out, but it's something that we often are resistant to, especially early in our college careers, because we're so stressed out about reaching page length. Who's going to delete something, right? It took every bit of our effort to get to page length to begin with. But I think you bring up a great point there, that revision, we have to be willing to take stuff out, especially if we want to make things better. Think about our lives, not to be cliche, right? But there's so many things in our lives that we have to, if we really want it to get better, they may have been comfortable for us, but we have to be willing to let go of now. So things like, say, for instance, sleeping in, we might love sleeping in, but we might also have a, say, a fitness goal that the only way for us to meet it is to wake up early. Or maybe we have a professional goal and the only way for us to meet it is to wake up early. So there's sometimes things that we've clung to because they worked for us in some way in our life, but we now need to let go of. And often that's revision there as well. So I think that's great. I think that's great, Ariana. I think you did a great job of sort of distinguishing the two categories as well. So it's really important there. Now, let me tell you a little bit of a story. We're going to flash back to Dr. Champion when he was just Jared in college. And I had a paper due, and I was working two different jobs. I worked a lot when I was an undergrad, which is probably something most of the people in this room here can relate to. So I was working two different jobs. I worked about 45 hours a week and was taking a full-time job or full-time course load. And I remember I had a paper due and I was ready to revise it. So I had turned in my draft. I had gotten some feedback, but it really wasn't super helpful. And I had a whole Friday night set aside. I was going to skip all the parties. I was going to do all that. And I was going to go sit down and work on this paper. And I sat at my computer. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm here to work all night. I got all night set aside, but I literally could not figure out what it would mean for me to make the paper better. I would move everything around and I had no clue if I was making it better or just shuffling everything about. Has anybody had an experience like that? Or can you imagine that would be a common experience for you possibly? Right. So that was where I was, and it wasn't the best feeling at all. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can do that. And let's go here. Let's talk a little bit about this here. This is the rhythm of a body paragraph. So body paragraphs are really they're sort of the bread and butter of your paper. In fact, I would argue that the body paragraphs are probably the most important part of a paper, that if you deleted the introduction and a conclusion to a paper, that'd be fine with me as a reader if it's a topic that I need to know more about. However, I don't want to read just your introduction if I need to know more. I need to know what you're saying in the body paragraphs. Now, let's talk a little bit about body paragraphs and why this works. So body paragraphs, we've talked a little bit we haven't talked a little bit, rather. A lot of people will come to class and they will talk about a paper, and a good paper, have you ever heard a good paper flows, or you want to make a paper flow? Has anybody been there? All right, any description, sort of like Ariana did a great job with revision and editing. Anybody have an idea of what flow means? How would you describe flow to me? A good paper that flows. What's that look like? Any guesses here? Be bold. Mighty forces will come to your aid.
I guess you can say like how like your transitions for your paragraphs flow into one another, or how
Great.
your whole story connects to each other.
Yep, transitions are often a good place to start for us, absolutely. And I see there also, thank you for that, Ariana. I see Kaya, it looks like you've unmuted, so you might have something to chime in about. Is that accurate?
Yes, I kind of felt like it was like, trying to go step by step. But what I struggle with is kind of making it sound too like how to. And that's where I struggled at. So I'm really trying to figure it out. And I hate that I jumped the gun in turning in my paper before I watched the ed puzzles, because I feel like that really would have helped me. And so I've
Yep.
been doing it.
Well, don't sweat that part. So for everybody, if you've turned it in now, you can always resubmit it. And so if there's a glitch on Canvas, then let me know, and I'm happy to make sure you can submit it. But I want to highlight the two things here, or the one thing specifically you said, Kaya, that I think is important. Is this idea of going step by step. I think that's a really important theme that we're going to come back to. And so it's not unrelated to what Ariana said, because Ariana said sort of transitions, which can deal with, when we talk about transitions, we're often talking about just the sentence that joins the two, right? So when we're thinking about transitions, but one of the things you highlight with the phrase step by step is that it's not just the transitions, it's also the paragraphs as they are in order to each other. So you've got one paragraph and the topic of that needs to step into the next one. So they can't be sort of islands, they can't jump around, but that will build flow. Any other thoughts there? I think, Jessica, you were going to unmute for a moment there. Do you still remember what you were going to chime in with?
Yeah, usually I feel like my mind just jumps around a lot when I'm writing, and I don't feel like I get good flow because I'll have a thought and I'll write it down, and then I have a separate thought and need to edit it later and move things around.
Yep.
Really my issue.
Well, that's speaking of good transitions, that's a perfect segue here for us to talk a little bit about the sort of common themes of writing and sort of how we write intuitively. And so let's talk a little bit about this, because your sense, Jessica, is spot on with what a lot of people are probably experiencing, where you've got a process that sort of functionally works for getting the paper finished, but doesn't necessarily work for creating or generating flow. And part of the problem here, if I can be so bold, not that it's a problem for you all, but part of the reason we struggle with this is because the ability for us to recognize flow is completely unrelated to our ability to create flow. And so let me give you an example of it. If I took us all, we all bought tickets to the drag race, right? We could go to sports, the track, right, where they're going to race cars, and every single one of us could pick out the fastest car on the track with no training whatsoever. But zero of us, presumably, could recreate and make the fastest car on the track, because our ability to identify what works is very different than our ability to create what works. Does that sound like a fair assessment there? So let's talk a little bit about this. And each one of you has shared something that I think is really beneficial for the whole class to kind of hear, because what you're all describing is a pretty normal experience. In a lot of ways, none of you are special as writers, because you're running into those sort of common complaints. So a lot of us come in and we think, oh no, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm special in the sense that I'm not good at this, right? That's a common feeling. Not saying anybody here said that, but that's a common thing that I hear, that people have been frustrated. But the truth is, you're all in very normal places as writers, and that means that there's a pretty normal path forward for us. And it makes me as a instructor really excited. So here, this is sort of the rhythm that in a body paragraph we would typically shoot for. And I call it rhythm because these are beats that you want to hit, but they're not the only ways to go forward. But typically speaking, most paragraphs, if you hit these 4 beats in this order, your paragraphs are going to have that sense of flow. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is, but let's talk about what these pieces are first. Part 1 is your claim. This is also known as your topic sentence. And this is where that transition will exist as well. And so the claim is when you tell the reader what your paragraph is about. And so, for example, if you're thinking of a description, in your description, if you say something is really interesting, that's a claim. You're making a claim that it's interesting. Then we're going to need evidence. What does it mean to be interesting? You're going to need to show us that evidence. So you make a claim, then you're going to provide that evidence. Then once you've given evidence, we want you to talk about it more. So everything you say after the evidence needs to be about the evidence. And that's a pretty straightforward way to do this, right? This, it's kind of sets the boundaries or the guardrails. If you've ever been bowling as a kid, right, you'll remember the gutter bumpers. That analysis is a little bit like your gutter bumpers, where as long as you're talking about this, you're staying on topic and it's moving the paper closer, most likely. Now, analysis often means when you're talking about little pieces or features in your evidence, and that's a really useful thing to remember. We can talk some more about that soon. The so what is one that trips up a lot of people or makes a lot of people nervous. The so what is really and truly just when you say in one quick sentence how this paragraph helps us understand the topic better. So let me repeat that again just to make sure everybody kind of has that down. The so what is just a simple sentence that tells us how this paragraph helps make our topic more clear or better, right? It's a simple kind of summary of it. Now let's talk a little bit about, I think here Jessica sort of described the way that she writes, and I want to talk you through how a normal person writes, and then we're going to kind of compare it with what we have here. So what a normal person does, tell me if I'm wrong, is you think about what you're going to write about, right? So if it's a book you're going to write about, in this case, it's what did each of you write about for your description paper? Let's start there, and I can use an example from each of you. What did you decide you were going to describe? Kaya, you've already turned yours in. Maybe you'd be a good person to start here.
I wrote about my morning routine of being a mom. I
Great.
just want to kind of describe how unique it was and how much I've learned over these past 8 months, because it is challenging to go from, just kind of having your mornings be all about you, and then you now have to get yourself ready and get a baby ready, and it's just so different.
It's absolutely 100% different. I couldn't agree more as I'm sitting here with little dude. He is, yeah, I get it. That's a great one. So morning routine as a mom. That's great. What about you, Ariana?
Yeah, I seen that example you used was about the tent. That's how you like to do it. So I just tried to think back to when I was younger and the stuff I used to do. And I used to ride scooters when I was a little kid. So I just wrote about the mechanics of a scooter and how to ride it as a kid.
Great. Yeah, that's dynamite. Yeah, a scooter and the mechanics of it. I love that topic. I think that's really useful. Great. What about you, Jessica?
I write about the local county fair that we have every year.
Great. Local county fair. Terrific. So we've got local county fair. We've got morning routine as a mom. We've got scooters here. Let me pause for a minute. Say hello, Princess. It's great to see you. Welcome. Hi, it's good to see you. So let's go back here and we're going to take a peek here at sort of the intuitive way that we write. So when I say intuitive, what that means is intuitive writing or intuitive anything is the way that you sort of normally think to do something. So for example, when I bought my first Macintosh computer, I went to the store and I said, hey, listen, these are twice the price of a PC. Is it worth it? And the guy told me a line that sort of sums up what intuitive means. He said they're worth it because on a Mac, if you think you should do, you should be able to do something one way, you probably can. And that means Macs are really intuitive. Where in a PC, for example, they're often not intuitive. Where if you've ever had a PC and you've like slid your mouse across the screen too quickly and then 6 new windows pop up because they somehow think that that's a shortcut, that means it's not intuitive. But intuitive means it's going to work the way you think it should work on the first go. So as far as writing goes, there's an intuitive way that we write that we're going to kind of talk about, and I'm going to use some of your examples here that can be really helpful. So intuitively, we typically start with evidence. So for example, Kaya was talking about the morning routine, and she might start with, when we first wake up, I grab the baby and begin changing diapers even before I have a chance to put on my glasses. Right? So that sounds like a pretty normal kind of thing. Does that sound like a fair, like something that might be familiar for you, Kaya? Something, maybe not the glasses, but something similar, that your morning routine starts with the baby and you come second. Does that sound right?
Yes, pretty much.
Fair. But see here, if we think about this, this is evidence here. This is an example that we're giving that's going to help our readers to see what we're trying to talk about. And so then what you're going to do is you're maybe going to think about this, right? You're going to think about this example and then think, all right, what kind of point am I trying to make? So you're going to look at this and think, all right, what is it exactly I'm trying to tell my reader? And so in your mind, your analysis, that's what you're doing, is you're analyzing, and this is all in your mind, right? And so we're going to put this actually in parentheses, just kind of highlight that it doesn't actually make it into your paper, right? It's happening. You're doing it. Most of us will do it. And then here you'll say, then your claim, my days revolve around taking care of my baby now, right? Does that all sound like that sounds like a paragraph that would make sense intuitively for us to write about, right? A normal order, normal processing. Now, here's what I want you to pick up on, and this one is really important. There are a couple of different features that are super critical here, as long as we agree that this one here is the intuitive way we write. All right, so if this is the intuitive way we write, and we're going to call this AKA a rough draft, because it's our first go, right? What's interesting here is, let's compare it now with the body paragraph here for a final draft. What do you notice that's different so far between the two? Any significant differences?
The order
The
of
order.
like the evidence and the analysis and the claim.
Great. The order is exact. It's not at all the same, right? And that's important. So then my question would be, why do we start with a claim? Why do we want to move this to the front? If this is the way we naturally write, why move it at all?
Because it's the topic sentence.
It's the topic sentence. Yeah. What advantage does starting with the topic sentence give us?
It basically is an explanation of what you're going to explain in your paragraph.
Great. Yeah. Why do you want to give that away though? Why is it good to tell your readers what you're giving? Why do that first, right?
I kind of feel like it's just more so of an attention grabber.
Okay. Yeah, I could see where that would come into play. Here's the rub though. The attention, if you think about the last thing every one of us has read, right? Everybody stop for a minute. And even if you're watching this on Edpuzzle later, think about the last thing you really, really read. And chances are good you didn't care if it was grabbing your attention because you needed that information. So for example, you might have read directions for a recipe, and you probably can't remember how any of the paragraphs started because you needed the information. You might have been interested in the sense that you wanted to have this finished product, but the writing itself wasn't grabbing your attention, right? The information within was. And so one of the things that I think is a good idea, and this I think Kaya is probably going to take some pressure off of you based on a couple of things you've mentioned so far. One thing that's really nice for us is to just let go of that pressure to be interesting. We don't have to be. We have to make sure we're doing a good job of expressing and articulating what we have to say. And we can't control whether or not our audience will be interesting. So we can put that baggage down and really invest our emotional energy elsewhere. So it's helpful to just kind of have that piece, but it's also very realistic that the pressure that we felt in that way in the past is very real, because we've been trained that we have to be interesting in our papers and we have to make our papers flow and do this stuff, right? And a lot of times that's not helpful to us as writers, because our job is, we can't make it interesting. And it doesn't even matter if it's interesting, because again, pay attention next time you pick up something, you're like, oh, I'm really reading this closely, and be like, I don't care how they wrote because I need this information, right? We're more likely to read directions for recipes, for assembling an IKEA bed, for building or for planning a trip, or making sure that we check into an Airbnb correctly. We're going to read those really thoroughly. We're not going to care if they're interesting. So we can put all that away, which is nice, right? But that said, Kaya, we're getting to the heart of some of this, where that introductory sentence is important because it tells the reader what we're going to talk about. And our readers need to know this because they're going to practice what we call skepticism. Skepticism means we, as readers, we want our writers to tell us things that are correct, but we're not going to accept them being correct until we've had an opportunity to measure what they've said against the evidence. So if any of you all have had the joy of following any of the Darrell Brooks trial, for example, right, then maybe that's probably not a good example because it's not a very classic. Did anybody watch that, by the way? It was bananagrams. It was really the most incredibly weird trial in the history of the world. It was all over TikTok. Probably telling you a little bit too much about my social media use. But here's the thing. If you think about in a functional, say, imagine for a minute that our judicial system really operated like it should, right? And so I don't want to make any arguments about how the judicial system does or doesn't work, because we all already know how we feel about that. But let's imagine it's functioning like it should, right? And in that, I want you to think of yourselves like attorneys. And so an attorney will make the opening argument first, right? And then as she goes through making the case, she will make a claim about a piece of evidence and then present the evidence and then talk about the evidence and then tell how that evidence ties back to the bigger argument. So make a claim, then offer the evidence, and then analyze that evidence and then tie it back, the so what. And the reason this works is because the jury doesn't want to have their time wasted. They want the attorney to be correct, but they're not going to buy their argument until they first had the claim. And then they need to see the evidence so they can check the claim against the evidence. And then finally, they need to see what they do with it. So it's all about presenting the information to the reader in the order they need it. So if we think about that process, right, let's think about just sort of where our eyes go if we're reading this, right? So here, if you're reading, you might read this evidence first. And you think, all right, that's great, Kaya. That's a really interesting detail. That sounds tough. I can empathize. We're not reading this because this is all still kind of happening in Kaya's mind, right? Not that Kaya wrote this, by the way. I'm just sort of hypothetical. So Kaya, thanks for being a good sport about this. And then here, the claim is here. So remember, your audience is going to check the claim against the evidence. So here they read the evidence and then go down and then they find the claim and they have to return. I'm trying to make sure the camera works here. I'm not very good at the mirror. Read the evidence, then they get the claim, and then they have to go back up and read the evidence again to make sure it lines up with the claim. And then they have to jump down past the claim to keep reading. Do you see how that's jerking their attention back and forth and around? That's what we mean by flow, especially within the body paragraphs, right? And so if we instead give them the claim first, they're like, that's an interesting claim. Her whole life revolves around this baby. Prove it to me. And then they see, oh, she doesn't even get to put on her glasses before she's in that room taking diapers off and cleaning things up. That does sound like she's exactly right. If she can't even put on her glasses before changing diapers, 100% her life revolves around that baby rather than herself. Now, what else do we do with this? What does that tell us? What do we learn about this? Talk more about that. That's the analysis. And then tell us how this really shapes or tells us how your routine goes, right? So tie it back in. So it kind of fits all together now. And my eyes can go straight down the page because I'm getting the information I need in the order I need it. Does that sound realistic or reasonable to anybody? Are you like, no, I disagree, champion, you're wrong, and somebody needs to take that baby away from you? Okay, nobody thinks I should lose my baby, right? All right, good. So here's the other advantage. By show of hands, just give me a thumbs up if you have ever been worried when writing a paper, if your number one worry has ever been, how am I going to reach page length? That's the number one thing. You're not worried about the topic. You're not worried about staying on topic. You're just like, I have a 5-pager due for champion. How do I even begin this, right? And so you spend all this time and emotional energy worried about reaching page length. But here's the perk. Let me show you this one. So if we all agree that this is the normal intuitive way we write, and I've seen thousands of papers in my lifetime, I can tell you that this is the way most people write first. This is the way that comes naturally, or we think about it. But notice what we have here. So remember, we put that in parentheses. Why do we put that in parentheses, right? It's because it's happening in our minds and it's not making its way into the paper. So when we look at this here, your claim is a sentence, maybe two, your evidence is 2, maybe 3 sentences, and your analysis is missing. So if we're trying to improve our paper, what we want to do is this process of revision where we're going to pull the claim up to the front of the paragraph, and that's going to show us that now there's a vacuum. There's nothing after the evidence. So what that means is we want to talk about the evidence and draw more meaning out of it. So we want to look at this one here, and we want to see what else we can learn about a morning routine by looking at this piece of it, right? The first thing. So if we're saying your days revolve around taking care of your baby, we want to see more about this. So here, what you might say is that this is particularly challenging when you zoom in because you can't even put on your glasses. So it makes everything doubly hard, but it's really important that you act fast with a baby that's fussy because if they start spiraling, etc. But this is your spot to really develop and talk more about this evidence. But remember, in your analysis, everything you say needs to be seen in your evidence. Think about that again, like that attorney. The attorney can't go on a tear talking about something different after she's presented some evidence. She only can talk more about the evidence to show this is how I know what I know, and here's what else we can see by looking more closely at this evidence. So the perk here is just by recognizing that this is a normal, natural way we write, what I would encourage you all to do is go over your draft from week 1 and say, look, am I opening with details? And if you are, then make a claim. Tell us what you're going to tell us through those details. Just spell it out for us, and then go down and start breaking down that evidence more. If you want a really great example of analysis, turn on ESPN anytime they ask a question, because the pundit will say, here's my answer to the question. So that's their claim. Then they're going to show a clip of whatever sport it was, and then they're going to look more closely at that clip and break it apart. So they'll say, look, check out here where this athlete's foot is. Check out here where their eyes go. Check out here where this player is in position, or check out the body language. They'll be pointing out details and telling you why they matter. And that's great analysis. It's also important. The reason that I love ESPN, I don't love ESPN, pause on that. I think ESPN their analysis is bad. I don't think they know sports at all. But what they do know is how to present information really clearly, because they follow the structure. They give you a claim, they give you evidence, and then they talk more about the evidence. If you're hitting those 3 beats in your body paragraphs, your paragraphs will start to develop flow pretty naturally without a whole lot of effort, and you don't have to worry about whether or not it's interesting or hooking the reader, that kind of thing. It's just giving the information to the readers in the order they need it. And if they don't want it, they can move on and find a paper they do, which is also fun fact. That's why we open our papers with a thesis, because we want the readers to know, 1, what we're arguing, but 2, whether or not they even want to keep reading, because we're all busy people. And so if you're doing a lot of thorough research, you want to know exactly what area somebody's talking about so that you can decide if it fits in with the type of work that you're doing. That starts covering this process of at least body paragraph revision. Do we have any questions about this before we move on to the next item on the docket here? Okay, great. Let's do this here. And if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I can pause on this one. But I think we can make quick ground here. We're pushing up against the clock here just a little bit. Let me talk about this one here. So fluff is anything that you maybe repeat or double up. What I would encourage you to do here in this case is go through your paper, and anytime you say something that's not moving the paper forward, if it's repeating something, then at the very least, rewrite it so it adds some new little thing, even if it's small. Get in the practice of adding something new and specific. And so specificity will really help. So if, for instance, you say, my mornings are really tough with a baby, they are very hard because of that kiddo, right? They say the same thing, but here, let's watch what we do here. They're very hard because that kiddo is someone I love and really prioritize caring for her in the best way possible. So we're making it better because we're making it more specific. And that's really the key here. Every time you see something general, make it as specific as possible. Get in that habit. I know we're running a little bit short on time, so we can't dive as deeply into that as we might like, but know 100% the best thing you can do as a writer today, tomorrow, and forever is to make your sentences as specific as possible. Now let's talk here about commas. And I want to give you, my plan had been to go through with everyone sort of talking through very specific comma work. But again, we're getting near that time and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. But if you have questions about commas afterwards, then I'm happy to set up a time to talk with you and work through it. The good news is we're sort of in this boom day of all of these great resources online. So I want to share with you my favorite resource. And get ready, because if you are, I'm 40, so I don't know how old everybody else is, and I don't really care because you all are your own age in your own life and it's not pertinent, right? But if you were old enough to remember MySpace, I'm going to show you one of my favorite websites, and it is technologically on par with MySpace, but it's so good they haven't updated it since then. So does that kind of make sense? It's going to look old school. It's going to look like I'm taking you back to the 1980s of the internet, but that's how good it is, that it's still popular, even though it's not been updated in, I mean, honestly, it's not been updated in probably 20 years at this point. So let's go here. I'm going to share my screen. So we're looking here at this. There's nothing interesting in the bookmarks, just a bunch of stand-up comedy stuff. So you're welcome to check out my bookmarks, but I know I do that too with anybody else. But there's not a whole lot of fun stuff there. Let's go here and let me walk you through how I got to this page and show you sort of a tour of one of my favorite resources. This is Towson University. Some of you might know it. Towson is in Maryland, I believe. And so if you go Google Towson Writing Center exercises, it's important that you add the word exercises. They have so many great materials for learning this. Now, let me give you the sales pitch for taking the onus on yourself and doing this work. Let me start by saying what I'm about to tell you is about how unfair the world is. So I recognize the world's unfair and I would like it to change. But until it changes, I want to give you all the tools to make sure that you're in the best possible position to succeed. There is in this world a number of gatekeepers, and they will confuse good grammar and punctuation with good thought. That's just the way it is, right? We're not going to change the world today, but the reality is, if you have typos and mechanical errors in your writing, people will often confuse you with being unintelligent. That doesn't mean you're unintelligent. It's sort of like if you were an athlete and you started a new sport and you didn't know the rules, you might still be an incredible athlete, but the rules aren't quite ironed out yet. So your ability to perform in a new sport doesn't reflect your athletic ability, just like your ability to know grammar doesn't reflect your intelligence, but people don't know that, right? So hiring managers, jobs, etc., people you're reaching out to will think that your intelligence is tethered to your use of grammar. So in that case, the best thing you can do is start taking some of that onus on you to learn this thing, because it will carry a lot of weight for you moving forward. I will also tell you this funny story because I want to let you know that it's not just me telling you learn grammar so you can get jobs. But I was applying for a job probably 10 years ago as what's called it's called a technical writer. So people who write sort of guidebooks or how to do something new, right? So, or sorry, what am I trying to say? If you've ever picked up a manual for how to do something, so your owner's manual in your car is a great example. A technical writer writes that, right? So I was applying for a job as a technical writer to do that kind of boring, sounds terrible, right? I'm glad I'm here with you all is what I'm trying to say. And in my application, I put in bullet points for what kind of skills I had. And the first bullet point said that I had, quote, "and keen eye for detail." So I had a typo in the line that said I had a good eye for detail. I said and keen eye for detail, which I still to this day am 100% convinced got passed around that office and people laughed at me all afternoon because I think it's hilarious now. But if I could go back and do it all over again, I probably would be a technical writer with my keen eye for detail. So let's take a look here. This is the Towson Writing Center. You'll get this sort of link and it's going to take you to this page here. And this is what I mean. It's not fancy, doesn't look great, but it is so very useful. So here, when we look at these different parts of speech, you can go to parts of speech, you can go to punctuation. I'm going to go to commas because that's what we're working on here. And here, you're going to start with these are all of the different ways to use commas, and they're going to give you a really good description of each, all of these different rules. You'll notice that it's not long. I mean, it would probably, if you sat down and did it for 15 minutes and just read it all, you could get through this in 10, 15 minutes. And if I told you that going to the gym 15 minutes a day would give you six-pack abs for the rest of your life, you would probably do it, right? And that's basically the equivalent here, is that once you really start to understand the use of commas, it pays dividends the rest of your life. It's not fun, it's not exciting, but what I'm going to tell you here is that spending a little bit of time each day on this, even while you're drinking your coffee or whatever you're doing in the morning, is really useful. But going here to the exercises at the very top, click on punctuation. You go through any of these different ones here, but punctuation is really useful. And when you click on commas, it will have all of these different examples of sentences. And you type them up, and then when you check your work, it's going to give you the answer, and it will link to the rule that helps you explain why the answer is the case that it is. And so these are infinitely helpful, especially with commas, because I can tell you, when I get an email from somebody who uses a comma in a good way, like really sophisticated way, chef's kiss, it's terrific, right? It really signals to me somebody who cares about attention to detail, that sort of thing. Is it accurate? Is it fair? Probably not. But is it the way the world kind of operates right now? Probably, right? So until that changes. So my recommendation to each of you, not only here in the space with me right now, but also watching on Edpuzzle, is spend a little bit of time each day just looking over this so you can start getting a handle on the commas. We're going to work more on them in the weeks to come. You've already started to see Edpuzzles about them, but the Edpuzzles aren't going to be enough for most of us. They're not enough for me personally. I still need a lot of work on participles. I'm not great at those. So spend some time on it and really start growing. And if you have questions, then let's set up a time to talk about those as well. But Towson Writing Center is terrific. I love those links, and I love going through those and working on them as well. All right, let's go back here and check over the, let's check over here. I want to talk to you a little bit about fanboys, because I did promise you that we would talk about this with independent and dependent clauses. And so fanboys is, fanboys are, it's the acronym for conjunctions. Conjunctions can link up an independent with a dependent clause or two independent clauses. An independent clause is a sentence, basically, is the easiest way to say it. It's got a subject and a predicate and can stand on its own. A dependent clause can't. So for instance, if I were to say, I went to the mall with, and my brother went too. Put a good comma in there. So if I said this is the first clause. It's an independent clause because it's the subject and predicate. It's its own sentence. I went to the mall, right? That's its own sentence. And then what follows it is my brother went to. We'll notice here that we have a conjunction, which if you've not seen Conjunction Junction from Schoolhouse Rock, you probably need to go to YouTube and watch that today. It will be stuck in your head for the rest of the afternoon. It was sort of the early 80s viral video that you need to see. But conjunctions join up two independent clauses or a dependent clause, which is I went to the mall. And then how else will we say this one? I went to the mall. My brain's a little bit fried now, so if you all will stick with me here, I'll figure this one out. To the gym. So this would be, no, hold on, I got it. Sorry, I'm losing my mind today. All right, I went to the mall and ate a sandwich at the park. So notice that this is a dependent clause, meaning that this can't stand on its own. So if I deleted the whole sentence here, ate a sandwich at the park is not its own sentence. I think little guy's getting fussy here. Give me just a minute. Let me text his mom and make sure she comes and grabs him real quick. All right. So you'll notice that what follows the conjunction is a dependent clause, meaning that it has to have the I here. It has to have the subject because the subject I ate a sandwich at the park. That's what makes it dependent. It needs that first part of the sentence. So when you have this, the way that I like to think about it is that the conjunction from above, so these are your conjunctions here. So a conjunction plus a comma equals a period. So I know that's a little bit weird math, right? But if you think about it here, if you're trying to decide if a comma goes right here, imagine that you highlight this, and if you added a period or a comma, so if you add a comma here, that makes this work like a period, and it doesn't work, so the comma comes out. Does that make sense for everybody? Now let's imagine it here. I'll back up and then back up just a little bit and say here, if I say, and I ate a sandwich, then suddenly it becomes an independent clause. So here, if I add a period, it works fine. So here, when we're thinking about it, the conjunction and a comma works like a period. Any questions on that when we're joining independent with dependent clauses? The last piece that I'll say here is notice that the word however isn't in this list. And so that's a really common one for a lot of people. However often gets used like a conjunction, but if you use a comma and however, it becomes what we would call a comma splice. Comma splice meaning that you're asking the comma to do too much work. So we'll talk a little bit more about that one in the weeks to come. But start looking in a little more to that idea of the conjunctions. I really do think people might think it's fun to look up the Schoolhouse Rock conjunction junction. Has anybody heard it here? I think Taylor, you laughed a little bit. You've heard it before, and Princess, you've heard it as well. Great, Ariana has as well. So Kaya is the only one. We'll send her on a YouTube rabbit hole to go track down the Schoolhouse Rock songs. There's also the I'm Just a Bill. That one's another good one that will be stuck in your head. You'll be singing it to your little one all day long. I can assure you of that. All right. I think we are basically running out of time here. So grateful for you all staying put and staying so attentive so thoroughly right now. Let me open up the floor here for the last 3 minutes. We started a couple minutes late. Any questions for the good of the order? Does anybody have a question about sort of the direction of the class, the content of the course before we wrap it up today? Princess says no. Great. There you go, Ariana, go for it.
I have one question about like when we turn in our papers, it says the ones from last week were due today, but I turned all in the last week ones. For the ones today, if I turn them in today, will that, like if I turn them in and pass today, will that be a late day or because it
So
says
for last week or for today?
For today. Like, will they be late if I turn them in later?
Yeah, because the deadline said Wednesday.
Yeah.
Yeah, for last week, you're good. Yeah. So that's a great question, actually. I'm glad you asked that one. And so basically what I'll say is for last week, that'll be one that I'll just adjust the deadline manually. So don't worry about it. But also, if you see that I've taken a deduction for work turned in today, it's also fully possible. You can ask Kaya, she'll back me up on this, that with a little one, your brains get a little frazzled. So if you turn it in today and I count off, just send me a message and I'll be glad to correct the record on that one. But moving forward, anything past that, and that's not what you're asking, I realize that, Ariana, but anything moving forward past the deadline will just be your standard 10% per day for the first week. Cool. Here, let me show. Sorry, this my wife's coming to get him, but here he is. This is Augie. He's a little cranky face right now. Yeah, he makes that face, is my favorite. Yeah, it's the blue steel. So there we go. Thank you. Great. All right, let me take off this whole harness thing. I tell you what, they generate so much heat. They really do. I'm absolutely covered in sweat right now. All right, so thank you for that. Thank you for that question, Ariana. That's a good question. And I'm glad you asked it because I think that you're not alone, that would generate a lot of anxiety for folks. So really does help that you asked that one. Any other questions here for the good of the order? All right. Well, that wraps it up here. If anyone has any other questions, any me questions, I'm happy to stick around. So I'll stick around. I've got another conference joining in a couple of minutes, so I've got a little bit of time. Thank you all, wherever you are. Have a great day. Kaya, feel better soon. I hope you're feeling great. Ariana, thank you for your contributions. Princess, great to meet you. And Jessica, have a great day. Thank you all, and I will see you all sometime next week.